New tonight, a rift inside the Democrat Party in Nebraska. One lifelong member is leaving the party. 6 News' Marlo Lundak spoke with her to understand why she's leaving.
This year in the Nebraska legislature, Omaha Senator Mike McDonnell voted to support LB 574, the bill that restricts gender-affirming care for minors. He also voted to support LB 626, which further limits abortion access. He was the only Democrat to support those issues, which is frustrating for members of his own party.
We have a party platform that members of the party discuss and debate often. And we want to get Democrats elected, but we want those Democrats to align with that party platform. And Mike McDonnell does not uphold those values. And
Angie Phillips ran for U.S. Senate back in 2020. She and the Nebraska Secular Democrats, a faction of the state's party, created a resolution to censure McDonnell. But on Saturday, the state Democratic meeting didn't meet the threshold to hold a vote.
We're not talking about simple disagreements. You know, we're talking about basic human rights. We're talking
now she's leaving the Democratic Party.
And we don't want to see any Democratic resources going to a candidate that would openly and kind of proudly take away women's rights and create laws that would harm the trans community.
Phillips feels as though the party isn't operating at the capacity that it could be. But UNO political science professor Randy Adkins says it's not uncommon for political parties to go through disruptive phases.
A lot of that's based on leadership and entrepreneurship and things like that. I think that cycles, over time. And so, if you're going to be if the party's less cohesive right now, in 3 years it might be more cohesive.
Although he does say that it's typically the majority party in the state that sees fractions. He says situations like the one with Senator McDonnell are outliers, but that internal party politics do have an impact.
While we're talking about process-related things here, process does impact policy. So that party cohesion is very important for political parties, whether they're in the majority or in the minority, to maintaining the policy outcomes that they want.
On your side in Omaha, Marlo Lundak, 6 News.
While not censuring McDonnell, the party did issue a statement condemning his votes. And in response, Senator McDonnell says he's always branded himself as a pro-life Democrat.